We have a special guest all the way from the UK. Her name is Sabine Paul. She started off in Germany with her undergraduate degree, and she went to England to get, then she went back to Germany to get another degree, and she came back to England to be a lecturer, and she went to Germany to be a lecturer, and then she came back to England to be a lecturer. And so she's currently, I don't know what's going to happen next, but she's currently a lecturer at the University of Plymouth in southwest England. And I'm looking forward to hearing what she has to say about the psychology of climate change. And I hope you are too. Afterwards, there'll be questions.
Thanks, Bob. Thank you very much for having me here and giving me the opportunity to say a bit about my ideas, talk about the research we've been doing. Obviously, this is a very broad title. I won't cover all of the psychology of climate change, as you probably expect, but I'll have some ideas about what's important and what I think we can do to communicate climate change better. Just to show you where I am, that's obviously Britain on the left-hand side there, and we're right in the corner there, as Bob said, in the southwest. I think it's the furthest university in the southwest. And what does it look like where we are? It's a harbour area at the top, the Barbican. That's the building psychology is in, this one here. And our main lecture theatre is in that church. It's not a church anymore, so we just hop across the road and go there. Also, to kind of bolster my credentials a bit, I'm pleased to say I'm at the university currently rated as the greenest in Britain out of 133. This is a People and Planet assessment they did last year. No doubt this is going to change, but at the moment I can proudly stand here and say we're at Britain's greenest university. Anyway, this is an overview of what I want to talk about today. I'll say a little bit on the conceptual side. Why is it difficult for us humans to understand climate change? With a few examples. Then I want to say a bit about solutions. And two aspects of our work I'll share with you. One is about future scenarios, using future scenarios to bring future change home to people, and visualizing heat loss at a very specific level, going to householders and showing them where heat is escaping in their home. So why do people have difficulty grasping the issue of climate change? If you've listened to some of Bob's talks, I'm sure some of these ideas are familiar. It's inspired by other people. This is not something that I've come up with, but I think it's nice to set the background to understand why people have difficulty with this big complex issue. And this is basically the argument that we're evolutionarily very old. We've got a very old brain over millions of years evolved, and we're used to living in very different contexts from the one we live in these days. We're used to living in small local communities. We know everyone around us. We used to kind of worry about the food we eat tomorrow, shelter, etc. So much, much simpler environment, no technology, nothing. So simple and local, and climate change is a very different issue, and it kind of conflicts with that ability, with that capacity, because it's very complex and it's at the global level. And just to illustrate this, this is a map produced by the British Met Office last year, and its purpose is to show what would happen at a global temperature rise of 4 degrees Celsius. So it's a scenario, it's a projection, and I think it's a great, fantastic piece of work because they show everything. They show all the different impacts from forest fires, crops, water availability, droughts, permafrost, to extreme temperatures. They show this for the whole world, so you have larger circles where larger geographical areas affected, and you also have a representation of the temperature change in different parts of the world. So, for example, up here, it'll be hotter, relatively hotter than down here, and so on and so forth. So I don't want to talk about the detail of this map too much, but what I want to say is this is quite a lot to take in. So for your person in the street, your lay person, it's a bit like, whoa, where do I start? This is very complex. This is very overwhelming. So global temperature rise, climate change is very broad, very complex. Second aspect, the human mind likes certainty. It doesn't like uncertainty. It doesn't like experts saying we don't know exactly what will happen. Often that's interpreted as they don't really know what they're talking about, even if it's witness to a lot of scientific knowledge. And the human mind likes vivid information, things it can see, it can feel, things that are right close to us, whereas climate change is often very abstract, always presented in abstract ways. And again, just an illustration of that, you would have seen these IPCC projections. There's obviously 4 different scenarios represented by these lines of carbon emissions, and there are 2 bad scenarios, 2 that are not so bad, but 2, again, to your person in the street, this is a line, it's very abstract. What does that mean if we have kinds of carbon emissions? It's very difficult to relate to. It's not very vivid. Final point, the human mind likes things that are immediate. We find it very easy to understand immediate causal effects. So if I drop a glass and it breaks, I can see, okay, that was me who did that. And we have difficulty understanding delayed effects. That's not just true for climate change. That's even true for health effects. Think about smoking. Telling people, stop smoking now, it will improve your health 30 years down the line, is a difficult message. People can't really relate to it. We also understand very well linear relationships. If I do a bit more of X, I expect a bit more of Y. That's a causal relationship. But climate change isn't necessarily linear. There's a lot of delayed, remote impacts. There's exponential development. And I've nicked this from McKay, who's helpfully pointed out when the steam engine was invented in 1769. So the argument is it's something to do with our burning of fossil fuels that has something to do with this effect. And it's both delayed, it doesn't happen immediately, it accumulates first, and it's exponential. So the simple point of putting all this together, and the argument is that we have an old brain, ancient brain, I think Bob's called it, has evolved over millions of years, and we're just at the end of this timeline. Homo sapiens sapiens, that's us. The CO2 curve I've just shown you happened over the last 200 years, which is a mere blip on the line, just a dot on the line. So it's not really surprising that we have trouble catching up and kind of facing this really different issue, different from anything we've looked at before. And I'm not saying that to say people are stupid or, we could just give up on them. Totally the contrary. What I'd like to say is we need to be aware of these limitations and really help people get to grips with it. So give them messages that they find easy to understand and help them overcome these limitations. So that's a broad kind of conceptual evolutionary perspective. What I'd like to do next is try and convince you that this is linked to a dimension of psychological distance. So this subjective feeling of being remote, being removed from the problem, which has certain psychological implications. So I've talked to you about the evolutionary conceptual side, and I want to introduce a much narrower theory of psychological distance next, a theory about the cognitive processes. So this theory I'm talking about was developed over the last 10 or 15 years or so by 2 social cognition researchers, probably social psychologists, cognitive psychologists called Nira Lieberman and Jakob Trope. And what they argue is that we treat things very differently depending on how close these are to us. And they argue that this psychological distance has a starting point of 0, which is right here, right now, things we can see, things we can hear. And the further away objects or events are, the more construal we have to engage in. So the more mental effort we have to go through, and that's linked to certain ways of processing information. So the simple argument is there are 2 ways of thinking about the world. One is right here, right now, things where we have direct sensory input, and there's another way, things we construct in our minds, things we have to imagine, and so on and so forth. So for example, I'm here in this room, I can see you today. Last week when I thought about this talk, I didn't know what the room would look like. I didn't know whether you'd be interested or not. You look reasonably interested. So it's that kind of distinction. And this has certain consequences. You can describe these different ways of thinking about things. One is they've called low-level construal, where you focus on the concrete features, on the detail or the trees, as in the proverb. You focus on the process, how you do things, on the feasibility. Whereas in the far distance, what they've called high-level construal, you think more about the abstract, the gist, the forest in the proverb, and you think about the meaning of things happening why you do it, whether it's desirable or not. That's just to illustrate. I'm in forestry at UBC, so I had to put some forest pictures in. Here's an example. That's the kind of research they've been doing. There's a large program of research. When I thought about the sabbatical visit 6 months ago, I thought about inspiring discussions, meeting great colleagues, really thinking about new research and so on, traveling to a very exciting place. And all of that is still very true. I'm very excited to be here. But the day before I left, I was thinking about backing up data, telling everyone where I was going, where the hell did I leave my passport, etc., etc. So it's the same thing, the same action, behavior, but you think about it very differently. Why is that important? Because their research program has shown that this is linked to decisions and behavior choices people make. So it's not just something that happens in your mind. It's actually got consequences for what you decide to do. So again, simple message is there's just two ways of thinking about the world. Now, I've talked about psychological distance as this kind of general thing, but what kind of distance do they mean? And I think it's very relevant to sustainability because they talk about these 4 distances, 4 dimensions of distance that are, if you think about the analysis earlier, highly related to sustainability. The first 3 are fairly straightforward. They talk about time, so things that happen now or soon versus later, delayed, and you can analyze them in terms of those processes. They talk about space, things that happen here versus elsewhere in remote places. They talk about a social distance, so things that happen to me and my family versus other people who are very different from me. The final dimension is a bit more interesting because it's a bit different. They say certainty or likelihood behaves in much the same way as these other distances, where certain things and highly likely events are treated as if they were close. And uncertain and unlikely events, where there's a lot of ambiguity, are treated as if they were far. And if you think about a remote possibility, that phrase, that kind of makes sense. And yeah, again, they've tried this out in the social domain. They've looked at health behaviors, they've looked at academic decisions, etc. And they've shown these links between the way you process this information, the way you think about it, and what people actually end up doing. Now, what we wanted to do is try out if this is actually relevant for sustainability, for environmental issues. And we used one method that they've used in their research, which is asking people to describe things in how terms. How does something happen versus why does something happen? And we just applied this to sustainability. And what I want to do first, before I come to the other pieces of research, is to show you these 2 studies where we used a simple experimental manipulation, just asking people how versus why, to see what the effect was on perceptions of sustainable issues. The first study is looking at the perception of climate change, and the question was either, how does climate change become visible? We gave people a sheet of paper, asked them this, and they wrote down things like there's floods, there's droughts, people have less food, or there's more ambivalence about food. And the other group was asked, why does climate change occur? And they wrote down things like it's human-induced, it's natural, it's carbon, that's the cause underlying it, and so on and so forth. And then we asked them to rate the distance they felt to climate change, to this issue. And we only used 3 of the distances: likelihood, time, and space. And overall, higher scores here mean always higher distance. And what you can see is for both likelihood and time, asking why does climate change occur removes the issue further. So just in line with the theory. So that means that people rate it as more uncertain after they've talked about the why. People rate it as further removed in time. And that's not quite significant, but space is going in the same kind of direction. So why explaining things in terms of why triggers greater distance than explaining things in terms of how. Why might this be important? Because if you look at the discourse in the media, in the press, etc., you often find this discussion, who's responsible, why does it happen? And maybe what this might suggest is that that removes people from the issue. It kind of alienates them a little bit, and that might be a dangerous thing. So this is a study about the perception of climate change, the big issue, the global issue. Second, we wanted to see if a similar thing applies to thinking about sustainable behaviors. So when you think about reusing your bags, purchasing environmentally friendly things, that kind of thing, we had a whole list of sustainable behaviors. And again, we applied this how versus why manipulation by using little vignettes. For example, Tom's considering reusing shopping bags. Please describe the details how he would do this. Or a different group was asked, please describe the reasons why would Tom do this. And then we asked them in this instance, just when do you think this behavior will happen? From next week to never, I think, was the top end of the scale. And what you can see is thinking about these behaviors in how terms raises the expectation that they happen sooner. So we have different behaviors. Those are things like invest in renewable energy, so that's much harder. It will happen further in the future. These are things you can do at home, such as this one. But overall, the pattern is the how explanation induces this expectation. And again, why is that important? Because expectations are important for predicting behavior. And there's a likelihood, we didn't measure behavior here, there's a likelihood that behavior will happen sooner if this transfers. So those are the kind of classical psychology studies introducing that kind of conceptual idea of psychological distance. And when we think about solutions, if you agree with this definition of distance and you agree that distance is an important factor in dealing with climate change, what can we do to bridge the distance? There's one suggestion from the studies I've just shown you. If you focus on the detail and on how people can engage in sustainable behavior, so really at the low level, you might have a better effect with your communications. The second answer is because climate change is often not visible, it's intangible, it's very difficult to relate to. You can visualize the intangible and you can show the future. And that's what we're trying to do in the last two programs of research. Before I talk about my own research, I just want to show two examples of what I think where people have done really well visualizing the intangible. This is a group in the UK called Carbon Quilt, and their mission is to show carbon emissions, to make that, because carbon is invisible, can't really see it, make it visible. This is a project they did with a local school where they measured their annual carbon footprint and then they visualized it in a local park. So they said, this is what it looks like. If you put all the carbon together, this is what it would like in the park. Of course, that's a very strong picture because there's a lady walking through it and the carbon just comes up to her forehead, which is kind of scary and you can't breathe and so on. I'll just show you quickly a second example of what they've done. This is using the United Nations building. So at the rate we emit carbon dioxide, it would take about 4 seconds to fill the United Nations building 7 times over. And again, I think that's a nice way of making it kind of tangible, bringing it home to people. The second example I want to show you is the group I'm working with at UBC, Stephen Shepherd. What they do is they go to local communities and show them what their community might look like if certain things happen, such as sea level rise. So they have this picture of the community. This is kind of what it looks like now. Then they show people what it might look like if the water rises by a few meters. And they engage the community in this, and they measure certain things as the reaction. What they find was that people report increased concern, they report greater understanding of mitigation responses, and an increased belief that if they do something now, it will make a difference. So just by engaging with the future in this way, you can make changes. You can get people to think about it differently. Okay, so these are, I think, nice examples. What I'm interested in is the psychological impact of future scenarios. And the next studies I want to show you are looking at using future scenarios, which I think is quite nice because it relates to the way climate scientists are dealing with these changes. They work in future scenarios, but we've used them slightly differently. So the first study, we tried to come up with a local scenario that's reasonably good, reasonably well based in science, but yet we treated it differently because we were interested to see the difference between hopeful and scary scenarios. So what we did was we took scenarios that had been developed by the Regional Development Agency. It's a government kind of agency that deals with current issues, and they'd come up with 4 qualitatively different scenarios in line with the IPCC scenarios, and we just took them apart and picked the good bits and the bad bits. So we had one scenario where things have worked out, where people got their act together, living sustainably, and we had one scenario where it hadn't worked out, where things had gone wrong and people had issues, problems, no sustainable living. And it was presented as a kind of newspaper article in 50 years' time. The date isn't on there, but on the one we presented there's a date, so it's 50 years in the future. This is what it looks like. And like I said, this is the positive, hopeful scenario where you talk about community orientation, economic growth is not an absolute priority, strong emphasis on equity, inclusion, so you've got that whole communities coming together to deal with this issue, protection of the natural environment, strong political objectives. Then there's a bit about how you can live in a sustainable world, what can the buildings do, how are they built. You've got communal hot water and heating systems linked to an incinerator plant, so you use the waste, you've got communal facilities, etc., etc. There's a bit about working, there's high awareness of environmental impact and so on. And the equivalent of that, the negative scenario, talks about communities kind of going down the drain, people are looking after themselves. There's no concern about environmental problems. Energy is very expensive, so it's the kind of opposite end of the spectrum. They're qualitatively different still, because we based them on those qualitatively different scenarios, but that's what we used here. And we had a third group that didn't see any of these scenarios. And what we wanted to check in this first study was basically what's the effect on people's mood and feelings. Why are mood and feelings important? Because, again, they've got predictive value. People like things that put them in a positive mood. It's a predictor of approach. So that was our starting point. I'm presenting positive and negative mood scores separately here. Remember, these are 3 different groups. These people only saw the fear scenario. These people only saw the hope scenario. And this is a control group. And what you can see is the blue line, positive mood, is much higher after the hope scenario than after the fear scenario. That's just looking at the blue line. And the red line, negative mood, is higher after the fear scenario than after the hope scenario. Not surprising, but it's good that we managed to, they weren't terribly extreme, they weren't very personal, these scenarios, but we still managed to show this emotional impact. What I also want to point out is that control was right in the middle, which is interesting if you talk about risk communication messages, because hope is very similar to how people are feeling anyway. If you talk about a sustainable future, fear is very different, so that might be the more risky message. That might be the one that puts people off, and people say, I don't want to think about this, it's just puts me in a bad mood. So that's the mood findings. This was some of these, I didn't say anything about the sample. It's a mixed sample. Some students, some staff, some community, some people from a community sample. And some of the students who engaged in this study came to me afterwards and said, that was really boring reading that text. I mean, it's a very simplistic way of presenting this information. And clearly there are better ways, such as visualization and so on. And some of the students came to me and said, that was pretty boring. Can't we do something a bit more exciting and add images, add photographs and so on, so to picture it a bit better. And obviously that's in line with the kind of psychological distance idea, where at least you can see things, you can see what they might look like. So we ran the same study. In a sense, we used the same content as before, but in this one, one of the students taped the text And we showed this with a slideshow of relevant images. So we just used, we found images that would relate to the text. And these are two examples: a positive, nice, sustainable office building, and that's actually a picture from a flood in Cornwall a few years earlier. So same study, but pictures added. And this was just a student sample. And in this study, we didn't have a control group. So this is the same scale as I've shown you before. And again, we find that the blue dots, positive mood, is higher after hope than after fear scenarios. And negative mood is higher after fear than after hope. Remember, there was no control group here. But if we compare this with what I've shown you earlier, a cautious conclusion could be that visualization enhances these mood effects. They are different samples, so it's not quite straightforward to compare them, but there's some hint in there that would support the use of visualization. I've also got a PhD student, Christina Boomsma, at the moment, who looks at the cognitive processes that underlie presenting visualization, presenting images, and she's particularly interested in which of these images stick in your mind, which are more impactful, which are the ones that you think about later on, the ones you tell your neighbor about. And we think that's very important because it gets at that question, what engages people? I mean, the worst thing you want to do is run a study in the lab somewhere. People go out the door and they forget everything they've seen. They never think about it again. That won't change behavior. So we're trying to understand what makes people remember, what makes people engage with this a bit more. So she ran a study following up. Actually, it's the same study. She followed up the same people from the visualization study I've just shown you. And she just asked people, which ones did you remember? Which ones were intrusive in the week following this study? And what we found, surprisingly, this will need replicating, but people reported finding the positive images more intrusive. It's surprising because normally in cognitive psychology you find that negative images are remembered better, more intrusive. So, like I said, we need to replicate this. But one thought is maybe people have been bombarded with negative future scenarios, apocalyptic scenarios and images, and they actually find this more memorable. It's more salient to actually look at something that says this is how it could work. So it's an early finding, but that's her project. She's looking at these kinds of processes. Okay, final study for the future scenarios. This is a study where we didn't want to look at the positive versus the negative anymore, partly because when we look at the discourse in the media, there is all these negative messages, all this negative stuff, and although we're worried that that puts people off, we wanted to understand what we can do to actually engage people. So if you have a negative scenario, if you want to communicate that, how can you make people think about it more productively and adaptively? So we used a similar methodology. We had a slideshow with an audio recording. In this case, it's a bit broader. It's not just climate change. It's pollution, environmental problems much more generally, all negative. And we also had a personal take on it. So this is a young woman from the future who talks about her experiences. And she was similar. This is, again, a student sample, similar to the students we invited to this study, so it should have quite an effect. And what we used was a paradigm from helping research, where it's been shown that if you take the perspective of a victim, you're more likely to actually do something about the victim's fate. So we had this story, negative story, where the young woman talks about her experiences, and in one condition, participants were asked to take the perspective of this person, to really put themselves into her shoes, understand how she feels, etc. And in another condition, they were asked to focus on the facts, on the objective information. And there was a third group, which was a control group, and they didn't see this scenario, this experience at all. And if you're a bit squeamish, don't look now, but this is the kind of picture we use. So the story here was she went outside without sun protection and burnt her hands. Scientifically, it's a bit dubious because, as you can see, that's the wrong way round the hand, but we just tried to find stimuli that would illustrate what they've been doing. And people were generally very happy with the story. They didn't really have any suspicions. We also, in this study, we concentrated not just on feelings, but we were interested in what people would actually do. So we tried to come up with a paradigm in the lab where people would engage in some behaviors that are environmentally active. And we had 3 indicators. One was just behavior intentions, so that's a scale, a rating scale they filled out. And then Judith, who ran the study, came up with a nice paradigm where she, at the end of the study, people had filled in their intention scale, and she said, okay, the study's over now, but if you're interested, there's some material over there that you can look at, and all sustainability leaflets that you can take away, and I'll just get ready for my next participant. And she turned away from them and said, thank you very much for taking part. And then she actually taped how long they stayed. She recorded how long they stayed, and when they'd left, she counted the number of brochures that were left behind to see if they'd taken any. So it's a kind of behavior indicator as good as we could think of in the lab. And what I'm showing you here is the standardized scores, because clearly the time spent is on a very different scale from the, for example, the rating scale. So these are standardized Z scores. And looking at the pattern, you get the perspective group engaging in more behavior, so they take more brochures. I think it was 4 compared to 2 brochures, but that was a significant effect. And they spend longer, and they have higher intentions. That's the black bar, the perspective-taking group. That's compared to the objective group, the gray bars, and compared to control. So compared to control is perhaps not that amazing, surprising, because they didn't see anything. They weren't given any information about this future scenario. What's perhaps surprising is these 2 groups were shown exactly the same information, but they were asked to treat it differently. And that different way of thinking about the information had an effect on these behavior indicators. So that's the future scenario stuff. And the final aspect of my talk is about visualizing heat loss. If you think back to this dimension of psychological distance, you could say, yeah, presenting people with future scenarios is a little bit closer, but it's still fairly distant. It's not exactly my house. It's not exactly, it doesn't tax me so much. But visualizing the heat loss of your own home is very close. I mean, there's nothing you can argue away. It's just there. So going on the psychological distance dimension a lot closer to the self, to that direct experience. We did 2 studies here. The first one was with a climate action group in a small Devon town, and Julie, who ran these studies, she's a member of this climate action group, so it was kind of from the inside, and we would expect these people to be fairly aware of environmental issues. They're keen to make a difference, so fairly green. The second group, this was done with a number of collaborators. Second group, these were home-based customers, which is a large DIY chain in Britain, who had never purchased a green product. We had access to their customer loyalty base, who they record everything you buy. So presumably they're slightly lower on green awareness, on greenness, etc. So 2 studies. What did we actually do? We used thermographic images to visualize heat escaping, and thermographic images look at the energy radiating from surfaces. So they're a way of visualizing temperature that you can't normally see. And they calibrate to different environments. So you've got a temperature scale here on the right. In this case, it's between 5 and 11 degrees. And the hotter the temperature, the brighter the color. So you can see here there's some heat escaping from windows, from the door at the top. That's fairly common. But what's really striking in this picture is this spot under the door, which indicates there's something missing, some insulation perhaps missing, a real gap. So from the outside, this is another example from the outside. And we work with the building engineers on this, so that it's a building engineer who takes these images and interprets them. I wouldn't really know what to look for. And the building engineer says, in this case, you've got this dormer window added. That's what often happens in British houses. They add a room with a window. And apparently the insulation, the problem is often that the insulation doesn't quite come up to the window. So there's something missing here. There's perhaps also some kind of gap here. And again, the walls don't look that great either. So these are the kinds of pictures we show people from the outside. Also, we take some pictures from the inside, and now the color scheme is reversed. So you're looking for dark patches, and these indicate cold air coming in. So here you've got a door, that's the bottom of a door, and you've got this gap. It must be very badly fitting. There's all this cold air coming in. We take these pictures in the home, and then in the first study we went back in person. Julie went back and showed them these images, and some of them she recorded to get that qualitative impact. And in the second study, our building engineer wrote a short report with the images and with recommendations on what to do. But the idea is that you visualize what people can't see, and the impact is often quite impressive. They go, wow, I didn't realize that. So study one, again, we had an experimental design. We had one group that got the thermal image plus an audit. We had a second group that only got an audit. That's just an energy audit where someone goes around the home and talks about carbon footprint. And there was a control group, and they didn't get either of the two, so a true control group. And we had a longitudinal design where we took measures before they had this intervention, and after a year, Julie went back and took follow-up measures. I just want to show you two findings from this study. This is carbon in kilogram CO2 taken from bills, which is kind of as close as we could get to an objective measure. So we asked the householders to take out their bills, and then we went back after a year and said, okay, let's have another look. And if I go through this step by step, this is the control group. Not much of a change, slight increase, but it's not significant. The variances on these CO2 measures are fairly large. That's the audit group. Again, not a change here, fairly similar ballpark figure. And what we're really interested in is the thermal image group. And here we find a just about significant effect, whereby at the initial point in time, they were fairly similar to the others. And after a year, they've reduced their energy use significantly. Why was this? We also asked them, what did you do in this year? So we asked them to report their actions, and they're things like having a porch added to your front door, which makes a huge difference, but also adding curtains, adding insulation, and so on. And if we collapse all of this, this is the number of actions taken. The thermal image group takes between 2 and 3 actions, so not a huge number, but again significantly more than both audit and control, who take around 1 action on average. These are all average actions. So we think this shows using thermal images to visualize this in your own home seems to be a good idea, seems to really drive the message home. The second study, as I said, this was done in collaboration with the Eden Project, with the University of Surrey, and with Homebase, who were keen on this because they were trying to sell more insulation products and so on, and they wanted to know how they could do that, how they could market it, etc. And because Homebase was involved and was funding this study, there was this kind of pressure on the team to really show effects. It was quite interesting to work in that context, because we always kept saying, we're scientists, we need to make sure it's kind of solid and robust and so on. But they were really keen to make some change, show some change. So they bombarded households with different bits of interventions and information. They got lots of information and advice. They got an energy audit. It wasn't just energy this campaign was focusing on. It was also about waste and recycling, about food, so everything. They were just bombarded with stuff. And they also got £500 to spend on sustainable products in Homebase. But what Julie did beautifully, she said to them, we need some kind of comparison group. We can't just do everything with everyone and then see whether something happens. That doesn't really make sense. So she convinced them to have one group that got a thermal image in addition to everything else. So they got this raft of interventions, but one group got an additional thermal report. And we're quite happy that that happened in the end. It was quite a struggle. Just 2 things I want to show you from this study. The first result is about self-reported draft proofing. And again, that's a range of measures from adding curtains, insulation, to bigger things. And this is in percentage. And what you can see is the thermal image group, in about 25% of cases, they did something about draft proofing. But in the no thermal image group, only in about 5% did they do something. I've also added, these are the real actual frequencies. And you can see they're slightly different sizes, the groups, but that's why I'm presenting the percentages. So again, thermal image seems to motivate action here better than no thermal image. We also asked them to rate their home on a number of items because we wanted to understand whether it was anything to do with the perceptions of your home that would motivate this. And this was after they'd seen the thermal image, but before they'd done most of the work. So I've put the actual items here because I thought that might be interesting for you. And we asked them to rate, my house is energy efficient, strongly agree to strongly disagree. There's very little heat escaping from my house. My doors and windows are good at keeping heat in. My house is very well insulated. So overall, that's the perception of energy efficiency. And what you can see is that the control group thinks their house is great. It's lovely and warm and very tight. And the thermal image group thinks, oh, no, that's quite different. So they're much lower in their perceived energy efficiency. The second lot of items is the action potential. That's perceived after you've seen the thermal image. So I need to do more to prevent heat escaping. I can pinpoint specific actions now. There are things I can do at night to prevent heat escaping. And here the thermal image group is better, sees more of an action potential than the control group. The final item is kind of the reverse of that. I've done as much as I can. The control group says, yes, that's true, much more than the thermal image group. So that's the two thermal imaging studies we did out in the community, in the field. And again, Christina's PhD, I said, is looking at the way people process images and remember images. And she did a study using Julie's stimuli, the images. She did this study in the lab to compare what it is about the thermal images, whether they are just more powerful. And so she presented two different slideshows again with the same text. So, for example, this was about loft insulation, where it just explains on what loft insulation can do, how much it would save you, etc. And then the only difference between the two conditions is in one condition you've got a thermal image on the left-hand side, and the other condition you've just got a generic kind of graphic. And this is actually from materials used by the Energy Savings Trust. And then she followed people up, I think over about a week again, and she asked them again, how vividly did you remember this? Anything stick in mind? She also asked them to describe the image that stuck in their mind the most. And again, this is indicative at the moment, but what she found was that the thermal images might have led to more elaboration, which links to this idea to engage people, to really make them think about things. You need something quite vivid, perhaps novel, and so on. And that's when you start thinking about the issues related to it. There's some indication here that thermal images are actually cognitively more powerful, make people think about it. Okay, what I'd like to do next is just show you two short clips from the 21st Century Living Project, which kind of describe the impact from the point of view of the participant. They're very short. The first one is about a guy who had the thermal imager come round and do the imaging. And the second one I'll say something about.
We had a report done by the project on basically the way we live, and we realized there were many areas in which we could do better. A gentleman came with a special camera which showed us where we were losing heat in particular in the house. There were two spots which showed up blue, which means an immense heat loss.
As the study found, when you show people pictures of the energy, the heat, the thermal energy that's escaping from their houses, it has that sort of effect as well. You say, wow, I didn't know that my house was actually so leaky of energy, money and carbon.
That's the beginning of the project, it is clear picture.
I'll stop her rudely there because it's a long film, it's about 11 minutes, and it's just online, so if you wanted to see it, you could do that. The second bit is again the same person talking about the more general effect the project has had on them. And it's nice because it links it to this idea of psychological distance. It's going away from the thermal images. It's also got a little bit from a home-based representative talking about how they're going to use this in their marketing strategy now.
Themselves as green. It's been very enjoyable taking part in this project because you do have these positive feelings, that you're getting more control over your life, more control over your use of resources, and you're doing something useful, something good. You feel virtuous.
And you're being rewarded for it as well.
It ticks all the boxes.
From this point on, we're going to make sure that we share the findings of this project with our suppliers and make sure that we're helping them as much as we can identify products and services to be developed in the future. We're also taking on board the findings and development of our own services. Now we know a bit more about how customers want us to help them make their homes more energy efficient. We'll obviously build that into our strategies.
I think the thing that most affects people is the feeling that you can change your own local life, the life around about you. I don't think there's much point in beating people around the head with statistics about global trends and one airplane trip too many per year or whatever. It's what you get up with every day, the warmth of your house, the productivity of your garden.
What are the interesting findings for us?
Okay, so that's just, they've called this film From the Horse's Mouth, just to get a view from the people who actually took part in it. Obviously, this is not your average participant. He was willing to talk to the camera and so on. It was fairly mixed sample of people. So, just a quick summary. Human mind has trouble understanding climate change, but we can help by using personal vivid messages, for example. Positive future scenarios seem better in terms of emotional impact than negative ones, but it depends on what you want to achieve. If you want a shock message and really shake people up, you might want to use negative ones. Thermal images can motivate energy-saving actions, and what I've hoped to show today is that kind of broad link that psychology tries to make between cognition, so the psychological distance stuff is about how you process information, to emotion, which is increasingly seen as important in the psychology literature, to actual behavior, which is always the challenge. How do you measure behavior in a controlled fashion? But you can't just remain with the intentions, because that's only half the story at the most. Just a quick, these are other projects I'm interested in. I'm not just into energy, I'm also interested in natural environments, and particularly marine environments. And we've got a number of projects looking at restoration in those, and restoration from very active things like surfing and sailing and so on. And we're also just starting a project, the bottom one here, on natural environments in healthcare, where Karin's going to show people in dental surgeries some natural stimuli and see if that helps combat dental fear, and if it helps them come back for their follow-up, and so on and so forth. So these are people who have worked with on these projects, collaborators, Psychology and Sustainability Group at Plymouth, and some of my funders. And of course, I thank PIX very much for bringing me here, giving me the opportunity to talk to you, and I thank you for listening.
So thank you, Sabine. I think one thing that you didn't mention is, of course, it helps to activate individuals who may not think as rationally as most scientists do, at least between 9 and 5. But also it turns citizens into people who will help to support policies that will help with climate change as well, which can be a big political problem sometimes. If the population isn't on side, then politicians go with that. And I think that's an important issue at a larger level. But anyway, I'm sure you have at least a few questions. Sabine? Yeah, use this because of the...
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed the talk. I have a question about the moods you were talking about, fear and hope. I'm coming from a different tradition of sort of humanities. So thinking about affect theory and how we can sort of complexify the fear and hope thing. Do you have any ideas about how that can be done through cognitive psychology? How can we theorize other feelings other than fear and hope? Because those seem like, polarizing and maybe not nuanced enough. When you said responsibility, for example, is not a good feeling, well, I can think of kind of a less cognitive psychology interpretation where, indigenous communities think responsibility is indeed a positive thing. So,
Sorry, I didn't mean to say responsibility isn't a good thing. It was just, I think, when I tried to explain the kind of community impact. I mean, responsibility is linked to behavior. It's a predictor of behavior, so I wouldn't definitely say that. What we try to do in this research is just have this really broad kind of positive, negative outcome, and we've labeled that hope versus fear. It's maybe not the best label. And I know of some recent research that has looked at much more discrete emotions. I mean, there's also some work on guilt. You know all this much better than I do. So it's very important to look at exactly what it is. We just use these overall labels because we had made this observation that most of the stuff we hear in the media is negative and kind of scares people, and there isn't much talking about positive futures. So it's a starting point, and we need to look more into what exactly it is. I mean, maybe what's also interesting is how we measured the emotions, because we used, for the positive ones, we used things like happy, content. For the negative ones, we used fearful, uncomfortable, and so on. So it is fairly broad, and it needs looking at the specific emotions, definitely.
Thank you very much.
Other questions? There's one.
I'm a climate scientist, so I certainly have had this reaction that if you scare people about the future, they just turn off and say it's hopeless. But in a way, you say, well, if you try to explain to them why they should act, it kind of turns them off. But if you just tell them how to do it, and that, I mean, there's still this, it's a bit like the first question, what motivates, how do you get people motivated when it sounds like mostly they just respond to how to do it locally, and that I find kind of difficult, that they don't seem to get the broader context doesn't motivate.
Yeah, I agree with that observation, and I wouldn't ever say, never talk to them about climate change again, but from the psychology point of view, if you talk too much about the bigger picture, people just kind of go, I don't know what to do about it. And I think we need to shift the weight a little bit from, we're doing this because there's this big problem and so on, but we shouldn't talk about it, I don't know, if you do presentations, maybe 80% of the time you talk about the issue, the problem. I think we need to shift the way to the solutions, the weight to the solutions much more. And that's not just in climate. I'm also a bit of a health psychologist, and I'm interested in changing behavior for health reasons. And that's the same thing they've observed in applied programs. If you say to people, oh, this is a health program, come and improve your health, they just say, oh, no, it's not interesting. If you say something like, this is a family program, you'll have lots of fun with your kids, they sign up. So it's just, it's not unethical, I think, to say to people, there are these benefits. And yeah, there is an issue, but in terms of communicating to people, it's very important that you keep those benefits at the forefront, or solutions. These are easy things you can do. Just switch off your light. Just it might save you some money. It's just a way of framing the problem. And I think the climate scientists, obviously, your job is to understand what's going on, and less so how to communicate that. I don't know. That might be a presumption.
Thanks. I really liked your presentation. I'm wondering if you have any suggestions for a situation like ours in Canada, where we have a certain percentage of people who are well informed, and some are ready to do something and so on, but there's very little backing from the government. And so one angle, one perspective one could take on this is that before individual action can be really effective, because you need some support for that individual action, you'd have to have at least some willingness on the part of governments to do something. I mean, provincial government is ready to do something, but not the federal. And so you'd have to have some engagement by individuals to lobby the government to do something in that sense. Do you have any results or research that would help us understand how individuals become more engaged in that lobbying effort, so that it's not just a few individuals who do something and the whole country doesn't really move forward or backwards because there's no further support for it?
Yeah, that's a big question. The programs I've seen where it worked well, where people have made changes both at the individual level and then started lobbying, because it often seems to work that way, where you really get a community involved. So there's a certain number of people who are kind of talking about it, who are making waves, and then it kind of goes from there. In the UK, there's the example of transition towns. I'm not sure if you're aware of that, where it's just the community aspect. We're all in this together, but we've got a kind of a scale we can understand. There's 20, 30 people, depending on how big the community is, and that seems to really work because you reinforce each other. There's another example where I went a couple of weeks ago, Eagle Island, just off the Vancouver coast, where they're using thermal images. And again, it's just a community group. There's one very active lady who's running it, who's talked to the people that live there and said, I want to do something. And they're all like, oh yeah, okay, we know you, we trust you, and why don't we change something? And at the moment it's just kind of awareness raising, but they are quite active lobbying the government, and it seems to be that scale kind of community. But the other answer is also, and Paul Stern's written about this, just make it really easy for people once you've got the motivation, because often what happens is that the system, whatever it is, a government system, a company that comes and does insulation, weatherization, isn't really set up or doesn't respond quickly. We had some people in the second study who were really keen and who rang up several companies to get a quote to kind of do something, and they never got a reply, or it took ages, or it was really complicated. They were like, one company said this, the other said that. And if you just streamline that, I mean, it sounds really obvious, make it easy, but it's the one thing that the cognitive cost, that's what Paul Stern talks about, is possibly more important than some financial incentives, depending on the context and so on.
Making it easy isn't always easy.
No.
One more question, I think, for one eager person. Exhausted? All right. Well, thank you, Sabine. We're glad that you came.
Thank you. Thanks.